going to pivot to a Palestine. Um, let's actually just read one section of this, okay? So there's an article. I'm going to read one section of it, and I'm going to do it quick. It's about Palestine because I wanted to cover this. It's in Mondoise, which sometimes publishes good things. I know it's a little bit more on the, it can be left, it can be also on the moderate side sometimes. Mondoise says, repeating the colonial mistakes of the past, President Biden, how many civilians must die to prove U.S. friendship to apartheid Israel? I'm not going to read the beginning of it because it's all about the visits, but I'm going to read the same as Trump to see what they say. So this was written by Terry Wall, who is from Ramallah, I believe, right? Board member for the American Federation of Ramallah, a Palestinian American. All right. Same as Trump. So this author says the language President Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken used regarding Israel-Palestine may lead people to believe that our government is a champion of the oppressed, but the details tell another story. Biden is abiding by the same destructive and one-sided policy that Donald Trump advocated to protect Israel and stifle the lives of Palestinian people under Israeli occupation. In preparation for his visit to the Middle East, the president and his top diplomats talked about the desire to address the issues of human rights wherever they visit in the region, yet they sidestepped any language about the oppression of Palestinians. They try to silence and whitewash any discussion about Israel's intentional assassination of American Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and other journalists. Furthermore, they bragged about their ironclad support of Israel by increasing their annual stipend to over $4 billion a year at a time when our own U.S. economy and people are suffering. Instead of pushing for a viable two-state solution, the U.S. policy since 1993, he announced that the time is not ripe for talk. Yet he did not find any irony in his action by rewarding Israel with more funds despite their continuous building of illegal settlements, their indiscriminate human rights violations of mostly unarmed civilian population living under their occupation, and discrimination against American citizens when they travel to their Palestinian homeland. In addition, standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel's Prime Minister Yair Lapid, Biden demonized the Palestinians' nonviolent BDS movement and adopted the dangerous practice of labeling anyone who dare to point out the human rights violations of Palestinians at the hand of Israel as anti-Semites. This counterproductive accusation only serves to silence those critical of Israel's apartheid policies and will undermine calls to challenge genuine instances of anti-Semitism. Through many meetings with our American administration officials, we have come to the conclusion that President Joe Biden's policies regarding Palestinian issues resemble the destructive policies of Trump. And during his visit, we realized that the policy is one and the same as dictated by Benjamin Netanyahu. So this author lays it out quite nicely. I think that Joe Biden is actually more effective here. I think what Joe Biden did on his trip was just absolutely insulting. I mean, he did just go after the left. He went after those who are critical of Israel. He just went after them. So, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by this. But I think this article does a good job by saying that, yeah, he's no different. And on his trip, he completely ignored the Palestinian issue. This is what people actually care about this. More than 60% of Democrats want the U.S. and want Democrats to support Palestine more. More than 90% of Democrats don't even view Israel as an ally. There is a sea change happening with the world, with public opinion about Israel, and Joe Biden is behind that. Joe Biden defended funding the Iron Dome, defended funding Israel, and he basically said he was going to do more of it. Listening to him versus Donald Trump, there's no difference on this question in many instances other than rhetoric. Oops, almost dropped my phone. Other than rhetoric. That's it. It's all rhetoric. That's the only difference. Policy-wise, things are staying the same, and Israel right now is conducting an assault. I saw that there was some more attacks on Palestinians today, and right after his trip, there was a bombing of Gaza. I mean, I don't know if it's turned into an all-out siege just yet, but we know that that's what happens. That's what happens. So there's no accountability. There never was going to be, right, from Joe Biden on the Palestine question. And Palestine gets a lot of attention from the left now, more so than probably any other foreign policy issue, right? Any other question of imperialism. Palestine is number one. Young people, progressives, leftists, there is a growing consensus about Palestine. about how Palestine deserves self-determination. It's not a lot of agreement about how that is. I think there's a lot more supporters of two-state solution. I, for one, am not a supporter of a two-state solution because I do not think that Israel is a um, is an actor that can do it. It is not a good faith actor. So you actually need one. I think you need one government, and I think that Palestine. This is controversial, but I do think that Palestine and Palestinians deserve to have more power over that government. I don't think. I really dislike this idea that Zionists who are armed to the teeth can remain in the same position they're in with just an equal player on the other side, maybe in a joint government. I even think that is naive. Israel is not going to give up its colonial possessions. It's not going to abide by any UN agreement. It's not going to allow the right of return. It's not going to do these things. So that's why I take a different position than most people, even on the left. Even, and I know that the situation is dire, so I am for. I mean, with Palestine, with most questions, I am for whatever will improve the situation. And if you got to test out some things and try it, but Israel's not even letting that happen. No matter how much pressure is put on Israel, I doubt it's ever going to allow a real two-state solution to operate. I mean, it's kind of naive in a lot of ways to think that that would happen. And in my opinion, I do think that the United States' situation is going to have to change a lot for things with Palestine to change, because the United States is going to have to it's going to have to change its policy on Israel. And the only way Israel the United States changes its policy on Israel is if Israel has a lot less influence over US foreign policy and vice versa. And the only way that happens is if the character of the U.S. government changes. So the situation with Palestine is quite complex. It's not just okay, we're just going to do some reorganization. We're going to have the UN more involved. It's not like that. And it never is like that. It's never like that because the U.S. exerts such a dominant influence over world affairs and world politics that Palestine's freedom and self-determination is really tied to how much the American empire can be weakened and what kind of struggle we can build and develop to weaken it. So all efforts, the BDS and fighting for a Palestinian self-determination, all those efforts should be supported with also the understanding that the American empire must be fought at a broad level. We can't really address the Palestine question if the American empire goes on the way it's going on, if it's able to wage endless wars and use Israel as a beachhead of its imperialist ambitions, if it's going to continue to be this colonialist state, and it's not a vassal state, but it is a colonialist ally. If it's able to operate like that, it's mainly because the United States allows it to. And the United States would never undermine Israel's politically, right? It would never undermine Israel politically because Israel serves such an important function. So that's why Israel has all of this influence, because Israel has such an important strategic function for the US's wars in that region against the Arab world, the Muslim world, right? In the cradle of civilization, Israel sits there as a colonialist entity waging acts of aggression on it was just bombing Damascus again and bombed Syria hundreds of times a year, right? More than 100 times a year. Almost at once every 3-4 days. That's what Syria has to deal with. Israel has assassinated Iranian scientists. Israel has been a terrorist state in the whole region and has its own imperialist ambitions. So we cannot expect Israel to just bow down, even with the wrath. I think that the Palestinian people can and will wage and continue to build and wage a valiant resistance movement. And with allies, it could have some success. But Israel's role in that region is a lot bigger and is a lot more broad than even what even the significance of the Palestinian struggle portends.